Hello, welcome to Cashcroft TV. My name is Kalen Ashcroft. Thanks for watching another video on history of leaders of thought. Today we will be doing Al-Farabi and Avicenna. So Al-Farabi is the correct name. There's also the Alpharabius, the Latinized version. We'll be using Al-Farabia because that's the more common one. However, for Avicenna, we'll actually be using the Latin version rather than Ibn Sina, which means son of Sina. So sorry for the confusion though. For one, we're using the Latin, and for one, we're using the non-Latinized version. It's just because these are the two most common names. So sorry for the lack of parallelism there. But nonetheless, let's begin with Al-Farabi because he was born earlier and he was a pretty big influence on Avicenna. So not much is known about his youth, or actually rather not much is known about his life in general. Most of the, as is the case with many of these philosophers we talk about, much of the biographies came much later. So a lot of it could be hearsay, a lot of it could be guesses, especially particularly that pertaining to where he was born. There's a lot of debate. A lot of people like to try to attribute them to their own countries. So take it with a grain of salt. I think what's more important anyways is the ideas anyways. But I guess geographically the most important thing is that he spent most of his life in Baghdad, and he spent much of his life amongst Christian scholars, despite being of Muslim origins. He also later spent a lot of time in Damascus. He also went as far as Egypt, and then he ultimately died in Damascus. The word Farabi means place of with water or irrigated. So it's probable that he probably lived in a small village around maybe some kind of river or by some kind of springs. But obviously there are many places that this could be, so that's obviously not very telling. There's good debates, sort of strong debates, that he came from Iranian origin. Supposedly his father could have been an army captain of the Persian extraction. Perhaps his native language was Sogdian, which would have been a little bit different from that which he was writing in. Or perhaps he had Persian origins as well. Also, many Turkish scholars have also tried attributing him to their lineage. Even more so, for example, here's a coin, or not a coin, paper money of Kazakhstan currency with Al-Farabi on it, and here's a Iranian postage stamp with Al-Farabi on it. So the point is, I guess he was appreciated amongst so many different peoples that he is worthy of them trying to compete for attributing him to their lineage. He studied pretty much, you could call him a polymath. He studied logic, medicine, sociology, pretty much everything that you could study at the time, with the exception that he wasn't as mathematically focused as maybe some of his contemporaries, but otherwise he pretty much covered everything, and he's probably mostly known for his metaphysics, however. In terms of his learning, so obviously we don't know specifically where he was learning, but he spent a lot of time studying in Baghdad. So he explicitly stated that he read Porphyry's Asagogi, which, as we've mentioned Porphyry's before. He created the Enneads. He was the student of Plotinus, so we've covered that, so if you want to get a little bit more background there. But most notably, he was considered the second teacher because he was the first teacher being Aristotle. So he kind of brought Aristotle's beliefs into the Middle East and obviously got a lot more traction, and just through there it sort of had a synergistic effect with the West as well. So he said he read the Categories by Aristotle, De Interpretational, and Prior and Posterior Analytics, and I imagine he probably got his hand on everything Aristotle that he possibly could. His teacher, Bin Haylan, was what's called a Nestorianism. He followed Nestorianism, so that's kind of a sect of Christianity where they basically thought that Jesus, the combination of his two natures, that being that of God and that being that of person, were combined by will rather than by just the inevitability. So just a small sort of fact there, but nonetheless he was studied in Christian teaching, and his main teacher, indirect teacher, was Aristotle too. You know, they say you're an abstraction of the five people you spend the most time with. He might not have actually known Aristotle, but he spent so much time reading Aristotle, you could say he's like 20% Aristotle, if anything, if not more. So there's obviously, although he did have Christian teachers, he was definitely Muslim, but there's a lot of debate whether he was Shiite or Sunni. I think most people can probably agree that he was Shiite, but that's just because it sort of aligns with his sort of philosophy, but he doesn't explicitly say whether he is Shiite or Sunni, so I don't want to delve too much into that. In terms of, so I guess we'll start talking about his actual beliefs, because there isn't really too much else we can say about his life as we know it. In terms of logic, so most of his logic came from Aristotle. He believed pretty much mostly what Aristotle believed, but he also added to it in terms of logic applying to grammar, and he thought he applied Aristotelian inferences. So Aristotle did have some sort of inferences, but he expanded on this, which I think is pretty important. So I think this is kind of truth for all of these people, even though Al-Farabi is considered so important. Part of his importance just was amalgamating the information of Aristotle and maybe only adding maybe 10% to this huge body of knowledge, but the body of knowledge was already so big it renders him significant enough. And he also, in terms of logic, he also covered some Stoic logical ideas, such as conditional syllogism and analogical inference. So you can see that in a couple of the Stoic videos that I discussed. But nonetheless, nothing completely original there. But once again, he not only took Aristotle's and added maybe 10% or so to it, but he also amalgamated it with the Stoics to make an even greater body of work. And the amalgamation, I think, renders worthiness by itself as well. In terms of music, so he wrote a book on music, and it kind of goes through covers twofold. Firstly, the cosmic qualities and influences. So from that, it's like how do the certain cosmological things affect sounds, and how does that make you feel and whatnot. But most importantly, he also wrote this part called Meaning of Intellect, where he says that music therapy can be used as a sort of medicine, and you can use as it has certain effects on your soul, which I think is something even people are still only just discovering today, that there are therapeutic benefits of music. And this was obviously I don't think it takes a genius to discover this necessarily, but it's, I think, particularly interesting that someone who is so maybe logically focused and so scientific in his ways also believed in something sort of different. So it just kind of adds to the fact that he was a polymath and interested in so many facets of life. In terms of his philosophy, so he's kind of the founder of Farabism. So Farabism was quite popular. Ultimately, Avicenna sort of subsumed his followers, but essentially it was kind of an amalgamation of Plato, and sort of, it said that he kind of amalgamation of Plato and Aristotle. He kind of moved beyond the two, where the two kind of focus more on metaphysics, where he sort of focused more on methodology. So if you've seen anything, read any sort of metaphysics or ontology, it's very, very abstract, and almost, it gets so far from any real world application, it's almost like I'm just trying to tire out your brain. Whereas he kind of focused more on the methodology and tried to really break it down into sort of first principles standpoint. But it is also said that he kind of brought it into modernity. So it's hard to say if individuals such as Al-Farabi and Avicenna did not exist to sort of modernize Plato and Aristotle, would we even remember those individuals? It's hard to say. He wrote quite a bit on many facets of Plato and Aristotle, but my favorite is those pertaining to particularly Plato's Republic, because to me that's the most interesting part. Those philosophies and those ideas which apply to politics or states or government or leadership, those are the ones that interest me the most. Obviously, I'm sort of passionate about everything, but if I had to choose one, I would choose that. So in terms of discussing Republic, so he saw, Plato pointed out that the leader is a philosophical leader, but Farabi took it even further, and he saw that not only should there be a philosophical leader, it should be a religious leader as well. So he thought that Medina, where Muhammad was the king and spiritual leader, was a perfect state. I don't want to go on too much of a tangent, but a really cool discussion on this is in Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. There's a debate between the middle child, that's Ivan, and this individual from the clergy. And Ivan is really an atheist, but and obviously the other guy who works for the clergy is not. But the discussion is whether the state should be not only not separate from the state, but it should be exactly combined with the religious sect. So what my interpretation of it was, the way Dostoevsky kind of designed Brothers Karamazov is that obviously these characters represent specific parts of society. He always sort of empathizes with Alyosha. Alyosha, it explicitly says in the book, Alyosha is the youngest one, sort of pure of heart, but sort of naive. But whenever Alyosha says something, that is Dostoevsky's beliefs. But I don't think he believes Ivan, nor does he believe the clergy member. So either way, my point being here is that I think Dostoevsky doesn't really even have an answer here. Maybe it's a balance of how much control the religion should have in the state. But Dostoevsky never tells us, but Al-Farabi does tell us. He says that the religion and the state should be one and the same. And that's even going beyond Plato and Aristotle. So once again, taking sort of their ideas, but expanding it to make his own greatness. In terms of, I guess we'll go into the metaphysics now. So he saw that God is an absolute being, but this sort of differed because prior, a lot of people in the Middle East had difficulties understanding Aristotle. So specifically this individual named Al-Kindi, who sort of wrote on Aristotle, really confused a lot of people, and they thought that metaphysics was almost synonymous with God, but God is a component of metaphysics, in that there's it's just a component of it. So he actually rewrote Aristotle, and Avicenna, when he first read Aristotle, he did not understand it at all, but after reading Al-Farabi, he understood it. So I'll explain a lot more about how God is part of the metaphysics in more clarity in Avicenna, because I think Avicenna sort of fleshes it out a lot more, but Al-Farabi sort of started the train of thought. In terms of cosmology, so he kind of combines like three great thinkers at the time. That's Aristotle's metaphysics, Platonian cosmology, and Ptolemaic astronomy. So pretty much Ptolemy, Plotinus, and Aristotle, all three individuals that I've covered, but very important. So obviously these three, all specifically Ptolemy, they believe in the Ptolemaic model, which is a geocentric model. So he believed that there are, as we have here, there are these rings. There is the first heaven, which is called like sort of the infinity, just the stars that kind of goes on forever. And then it kind of breaks down Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon, Earth. And then once you get to Earth, you get to this thing called, how things get manifest itself is through what's called first cause. And that's essentially God creating things here on Earth. But once you get from the innermost sphere to Earth, it crosses between sort of the heavens and into the material sphere. And what he doesn't actually explicitly explain what creates everything, but he justifies it through negative theology. So he doesn't say what this God is, he says what this God is not, which is, I don't know, maybe a better way of approaching a lot of problems if you can't go in the direct sense. In terms of physics, he also had a pretty, not metaphysics now, real, like physical physics. He came up with some good discussions regarding the vacuum. So the vacuum already existed. We already talked sort of about the void with respect to Parmenides, but essentially he was supposedly experimenting with a plunger in water. I didn't even know they had plungers this long ago, let alone toilets, but nonetheless apparently it was maybe actually that's probably false. They probably didn't necessarily use plungers just for toilets. They probably used it for all kinds of pipes. But anyways, he discovered that as a volume expands, the air particles must expand. So as things get towards this, what's called a perfect vacuum, that's when essentially the particles could get infinitely spread out. But this is something incomprehensible. But he thought as we approach this vacuum, there's less resistance, and that was further expanded on by Avicenna. So something very Democritean, not a lot of people think, as I've noted, if you've seen my Democritus video, Democritus is not very, he has pretty much no relation to democracy. He's known for actually his theory of atoms and such. So it's very, his theory of the vacuum is very well connected with Democritean beliefs. So very fascinating there. In terms of psychology, I got a couple quotes up here. So he also wrote on psychology too, which is what I think puts a philosopher on the next level. Whereas a lot of people were very descriptive, he was instructive too. So that actually, like, it's one thing to explore all the cosmos and spend all their time looking at it, but to actually delve into how people should live their lives. That's why I think astrology became a sort of science. People spend their whole time just staring at these star patterns, and they want to kind of extrapolate meaning into their own life. So they perhaps say, Mars is god of war, so he says fight, or something like that. That's just an example. That's nothing to do with Al-Farabi. But going back to psychology, he was also instructive. So he thought mostly in the importance of groups. I think that would be the most important component of his psychology. So an isolated individual cannot achieve all the perfections by himself without the aid of other individuals. That's funny, I forgot an L there, so perhaps with other individuals I would have got that L in there, because I'm working by myself, therefore no perfection, so how ironic. Another one, every person has an innate disposition to join another human being in the labor he ought to perform in order to achieve what he can of that perfection. Every man needs to stay in the neighborhood of others and associate with them. So just this is kind of, I think, very humble in his own sense. He's not one to attribute everything that he did to himself. He attributes it all to his teachers, but he also saw this as a sort of instructive way of living your life. If you want to learn anything, if you want to achieve anything, you have to work with other people. And I think that is true. I think that's very true. I think a certain amount of isolation will render one more unique, but at the end of the day, in the final analysis, I think groups sort of socialize people and allow them to achieve greatness. Let's see. Yeah, so in terms of epistemology or eschatology, as we said, there's this, once we get into the earth, the innermost ring, humans sort of sit in between two worlds. There's the higher world and the lower material world. So the higher world is an immortal world of celestial intellects, and the lower world is a material world of generation and decay. So I like that because a lot of people, or a lot of past philosophers, have had a kind of pessimistic of the human material world. But he said the human material world is not just a world of decay, it's a world of generation and decay. So, there's a quote that, the gods, if there are gods, or the heavens, they envy the mortal, because not only do we generate, we also grow, we learn, which is almost worth all the decay. So he thought, therefore, your physicality was part of the lower world, but your rationality or your thoughts are part of the higher world. So therefore, contemplation and rationality leads to happiness and human perfection, or the higher world. So he divided intelligence up into potential intelligence, actual intelligence, acquired intelligence. So these are three states, and then there's agent, which is also referred to as the 10th intellect, which might be confusing because they're one of the 4 pillars of Al-Farabi's intelligence. However, it's still called the 10th intellect, and it also could refer to the moon. But essentially, it's the getting to the higher world. Whereas, for example, acquired intelligence is like, I read this fact in a book, or I learned a new word in a different language. But agent is when you sort of get connected with this higher world, or with this, I guess this is a good time to talk about his theory of the afterlife. So he thought there is no personal experience, as a lot of contemporaries at the time thought. You go to heaven and walk around in this beautiful, I don't know what your perspective would be, but maybe in some beautiful apple garden or something like that. But he thought of nothing like that. He thought that the soul dies, but the component, if it does exist, if you achieve some kind of perfect component, it gets combined with the higher world. So I think that's a nice thought, that maybe this is not necessarily what he means, but maybe this would be a cool way to expand on that your body will die, but your ideas, if they are right, if it is perfectly rational, then it gets concluded in the full body of knowledge. So I guess that's a way to get the afterlife. I guess a perfect idea would be something that would go into the afterlife and go into human history. So in terms of I guess lastly, in terms of soul, he sort of believed in Aristotle's outline, which is there's the appetitive component of the soul, which has desires and aversions, like it's hungry. There's the sensitive, which is basically perceiving things and sensing things. The imaginative, which is recollection. So like that's, you saw the apple and you sense the apple, and then you can imagine the apple later. And lastly, there's the rational, which once again comes to intellect, and that's the higher world. So the first three are apply to humans only. So the rational, the intellect, the higher being, only humans have that. So that was also a very Aristotelian belief. Aristotle thought that humans were obviously at the top of the dominance hierarchy, but Aristotle was also a racist, so I don't think him and Al-Farabi would have gotten along. When Alexander the Great was going into Persia, Aristotle said to enslave the Persians, whereas Alexander actually chose not to. Alexander chose to treat the Persians as humans, and therefore created, I would say, the greatest empire of all time, or temporary empire. So, but anyways, only humans had these. Every animal had the first three, and then rational was only for humans. An interesting one is the third one, the imaginative. So he thought that this was a particularly important soul characteristic for a prophet. So a prophet had to perceive the world, imagine it, and then be able to apply it to something else and to be able to share people. He thought that prophets almost had a higher importance than philosophers in society. And that skill of being able to share information is very important. In terms of, once again, going back to practical philosophy, just to make sure we cover everything. So once again, he was practical. He made actual applications rather than just being descriptive, like many other people we've discussed. So he thought those who didn't were considered futile philosophers, just describing the world, just writing things down. But it was very important. I think maybe even earlier philosophies probably had more of a predisposition to observe and describe the world, because Aristotle had to write down, I think it was over 500 plants and animals, whereas someone else could just build on that. So I think earlier stages had to be more descriptive, so to call them a futile philosopher might be a little bit harsh, but nonetheless being instructive is important. So he thought that, for example, for a physician, they must balance the humors, or balance like your body, exercise but eat, so you balance it. But also the same thing applies to cities, and a virtuous city, and going back to like a Platonic. So obviously all of his philosophies about balancing things and stuff apply to the human, but also the city and the state, and was very instructive. So just to cover all the things here, here's just some manuscripts from some of his writings. This is the Ptolemaic model. Here's the last quote: philosophy precedes a religion in the time. So basically, a couple things here. Firstly, he thinks that religion is more important than philosophy. Like a religious leader, obviously he thought Prophet Muhammad was superior to himself, because one actually managed to was just more important. But also this component of time, in that he thought that, for example, the perfect and the eternity is not subjected to time. So my perception of this, and this might be taking it a little bit too far, but philosophy precedes religion in the time, but religion is not dependent on time. So I might be going a little bit too far into that, but I think that the word time here is very important, and it must be specifically thought about, because if it wasn't necessary, we would have just written philosophy precedes religion. But that's not true. He does not believe that's true. He actually thinks religion precedes philosophy, or not in terms of time, but in terms of importance. So just going on there. There's also an asteroid named after him in the main belt. I guess that's important. In his book on music, here's a drawing of an instrument. So I guess I don't think he actually necessarily designed this, but I think he must have had some kind of comprehension of engineering or something. Well, obviously he knew his physics. So, and here's a coin from I called it a coin again, paper money from Kazakhstan, and a stamp from Iran. So, yeah, moving on to Avicenna. So he's actually born Abu Ali Sina, or Ibn Sina would be the most common, or Per Sina. But basically, Ibn Sina is the main one, which means son of Sina. But for anyone in the West, they'd probably be more familiar with the term Avicenna, so I actually use the Latin name for him. But I might interchangeably use the word Ibn Sina, son of Sina. So he was a Persian Muslim polymath. So he was good. He was a physician, astronomer, geographer, thinker, writer, psychologist, mathematician, poet, pretty much everything during the Islamic Golden Age. Considered the founder of modern medicine. He's up here, I got this quote, the most influential philosopher of pre-modern era by the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So that's a pretty big title to give to a encyclopedia that focuses solely on philosophy. So in terms of the hierarchy, you can see where he stands there. I suppose, well, he did write 450 works total, supposedly, and about 240 are still remaining, so I wouldn't expect you to read all of them, but to give you a kind of outline, about 150 of those 240 are based on philosophy, and 40 are based on medicine. So one might abstract this and be like, oh, he was definitely more interested in philosophy than he was interested in medicine, because he's got 150 philosophy pieces remaining. But this could be a sample bias in that, less than his total body of works less than half were philosophy, but for some reason they were retained. So these might not have been his most passionate about, but they were the most, maybe the most truth into it, or the most long-lasting value. As I said with Al-Farabi, the great ideas will be included in history, but wrong ideas will not. That's why even the medicine, some of the stuff is probably we don't need to remember false medical information. So, but still, nonetheless, many still exist to this day. This book of healing is very important. It's called Book of Healing, but it's mostly on philosophy and science, sort of an encyclopedia. And the Canon of Medicine is a medical encyclopedia. So if you're going to read just two, I would say those would be the two to read. They're also, I believe, they're his two longest. And it was pretty much, the Canon of Medicine was pretty much a standard during all of medieval universities. So yeah, I guess starting off with his life. So Ibn Sina, meaning son of Sina, he was the great-grandson of Sina, but not much is even known about Sina, so it's just kind of, not too important. He was born in 980 AD, as written here, in Afshana, which is near Bukhara, which is in modern-day Uzbekistan. It's now the 5th largest city, but at the time it rivaled Baghdad as the cultural capital of the Islamic world. So it was although he lived on the outside, he lived close to a pretty important city, which I think is, as I mentioned before, and I don't want to beat this point to death, but it is like, I believe even one of the philosophers even explicitly says, and if you can remember which video I said it in, but they say that, I think it was Plutarch. Plutarch said that a philosopher needs to be firstly great, but also being born in a great city is a huge advantage in terms of he was referring to getting political power, but also same thing would apply for intellectual endeavors. So his mother was a local of Bukhara, so maybe she wasn't as wealthy, but his father was an Ismaili scholar from Afghanistan, and he was working for the Sumanid government in their little small village. So he was working for the government, so probably pretty powerful, obviously powerful enough to get him able to read all these books and not have to be necessarily spending too much time laboring or anything of that sort. By the age of 10, it said that he had the whole Quran memorized and many other important pieces of Islamic literature. So I think it's possible that he had the whole thing memorized, but that's quite an amazing achievement. But then again, imagine that they didn't have the internet back then. If you had 3 books and nothing else to do, you go work for I don't know, you'd have a lot of time to read. But by the age of 10, to memorize the whole Quran, that's pretty extreme. Granted, it's not too long. I have a copy of the Quran. I read through it, quite often. I actually like it. It's more, I read it differently, and most people read it differently. I read it as I read all the religious texts in the same style. I read any book sort of just like literature. It's like they're just great, beautiful stories, and they've been tested by time. It's no cheap, low budget book, no cheap, low budget story. They're all great stories, and they all have pretty good lessons to learn from them. I don't think you necessarily have to believe in the spiritual parts or any of the sort of metaphysical parts. So, yeah, but nonetheless, it's not too long, and he memorized that. He also studied Indian arithmetic from a greengrocer in his community. He studied medicine from a wandering scholar. He studied fiqh, which is called Islamic jurisprudence, under Sunni Hanafi, who was an Ismaili. Probably it helped because his father was Ismaili, and it probably connected him with the Ismaili community, who were probably pretty successful in the community, at least from his own father's perspective, and considering this individual had a legal background. Abu Abdallah and Tali taught him about Porphyry, who was a student of Plotinus, who we discussed, who wrote Enniacs. Euclid, who wrote The Elements, a very important book on mathematics. I was going to cover Euclid. I might still do it, but you could just get the Euclid's textbook, and it would be a very repetitive of like first 4 grades of mathematics, but nonetheless extremely important person. And he also really loved Ptolemy's Almagest, who we covered Ptolemy, but we also covered Hypatia, and in that video, Theon, who sort of remodernized Almagest. Said supposedly that he read Aristotle's Metaphysics 40 times, and he had no idea what it meant. He would go to the mosque and just sort of wait there until he discovered the light, until he could figure it out. So it really didn't make any sense of it until he read Al-Farabi's commentary on it. Al-Farabi, the individual we just discussed, and suddenly he thought it was like a gift from gods. And he bought Al-Farabi's book for only 3 dirhams, which is even today very cheap. Well, I guess it would have then been more expensive, but nonetheless, I believe, according to sources, that was cheap for then. So anyways, it was like a gift from God, and it was probably important for an important process, because Aristotle might have been a bit foreign, might have been hard to read, and then when Al-Farabi, not necessarily one from the same city, but someone who might have had a little bit more in common with him, once again, kind of like an indirect teacher, he got access to this commentary. Very, very important. Once again, was he Sunni, Shia, or Ismaili? Hard to say. They say maybe Sunni because that was the power of the government was predominantly, the powerful people were predominantly Sunni at the time. Some sources say he was a 12er, which is probably like just pretty much traditional Shia. But I like the idea that he was Ismaili. I think that makes the most sense because his father was Ismaili. One of his teachers of medicine was Ismaili. So I think that one makes the most sense to me, but who knows, it could be any of these religions. So his first appointment was a physician for an emir, who's like an emir, it's like an emirati, like an aristocrat, and he owed his recovery from illness to him, so he was obviously very important. But this gave him access to the royal library, so this was hugely important for advancing his learnings. But eventually this royal library burned down, and he got accused for burning the books, saying that he wanted to hide his own knowledge to himself. So the thing that rings a bell for me there is Alexander told Aristotle at one point, don't write the books down, because he wanted to keep the knowledge for himself. But I don't get that idea about Avicenna. I think Avicenna I don't think he would have had any intentions of burning books, even if it did give him a competitive advantage. There's no explicit writings of him really debating with anyone else. Sometimes he gets attacked by critics, but I don't think he would burn down a library, especially a royal library, especially considering it was an employer that. But nonetheless, it could be possible. And I like to err on the assume things are true side, just because it creates for better fiction. But nonetheless, I don't really believe that one. At 22, his father died, and at 24, the Samanid Empire ended. So kind of out of a job there, and so he headed north to Turkmenistan. So unlike Al-Farabi, I think Al-Farabi was an exception in one who, or he traveled a little bit. Apparently, he went to like Aleppo. He went to Egypt and such, but he didn't travel as much as some of our other philosophers. Whereas Avicenna, I think, traveled a little bit more. So he went north to Turkmenistan. Supposedly, he was offered a lot of posts there because he worked for an emir, and he probably was very well qualified, but he turned down a lot of jobs. So this kind of reminds me of maybe Buddha or Mahavira. They kind of just left everything. They were offered all these jobs. They could have had such a great life, but they chose to kind of go on their own spiritual journey. So I see a parallel there. This individual named Qabbas, a ruler of Tabaristan, which is now North Iran, sort of by the coast, was a poet and a scholar, was really fascinated by Avicenna's philosophies, but unfortunately he was starved to death by his own troops, so that didn't provide long-term employment. He went to Gorgan by the Caspian Sea, and he lived in this small dwelling with a friend, and he studied logic and astronomy, and he lectured there. But he started around this time getting sick. Maybe that's also why it coincided with him writing Canon on Medicine. It's I don't think that necessarily discredits him. It's not like he would not have pursued medicine if he himself wasn't sick. I do think that it is more respectable when someone fights for something they're not necessarily subjected to. That's why, for example, I really admire Abraham Lincoln, because he fought for the slaves despite him not being a slave. So I think that's important. But I think Avicenna would have been fascinated in medicine regardless, because we have this quote here: medicine is no hard and thorny science like mathematics and metaphysics, so I soon made great progress. I became an excellent doctor and began to treat patients using approved remedies. So also he was just sort of told to, he'd been studying medicine his whole life. I think he would have written books regardless of whether he got sick or not, but you can take what you want with that information. But eventually he goes to Ray, which is close to Tehran, which is obviously the capital of Iran, and he starts working for this high-born lady, but the emir calls him to work for him in Tehran, and he becomes a vizier and a medical attendant. So, and he really wanted Avicenna. He sent him gifts to his head, so there was a lot of bribery here. So I think it's, they say those who have everything more will be given. Once he got famous, he just had more jobs than he could turn down. So, but he sort of also, in many cases, he was getting forced to teach people. So when your knowledge is that valuable, it sort of starts becoming an impediment. He was sickly, but he kept teaching. I think he kind of wanted to be elsewhere. But eventually the emir died, so he was no longer a vizier. He was an apothecary. He lived in this small apothecary, which is kind of like a traditional like alchemy lab, you might imagine. But there were power struggles in the area, so he fled out as an ascetic, which I think this is an interesting point. So I was saying he was kind of like a Mahavira and Buddha, and that he was turning down jobs and just kind of wanted to live his own way. But the fact that he disguised as an ascetic, I think, is an important thing to note, that it would be sufficiently different from himself. So ascetic is like one who like starves themselves or lives like a very simple life, not as far as cynicism, who live in like pots and literally live in rags, but asceticism is similar. Sometimes it goes as far as body mutilation. Mahavira would mutilate his body, but for Avicenna pretends to be an ascetic and he sneaks out. That must mean that normally he was very luxurious. Maybe not, maybe he was just normal, but he definitely wasn't an ascetic. So that's a clear difference between some of our other earlier Eastern philosophers, but they're even farther southeast in India. But there's so he heads to Isfahan, the south of Tehran. He eventually starts working for a prince from the Kakuyid dynasty, but and he does this for about 10 to 12 years, and he's sort of a physician for this prince in the Kakuyid dynasty. The actual individual's name was Al-Dawla, but eventually they're marching, and he was brought on the military campaigns with the dynasty as well. He gets a colic, which is basically a severe pain bout, and he said that he was told, take it slow, so we can make it to the end of the excursion. But he just stopped, and he said, I prefer a short life of one with a narrow one. I prefer a short life of width to a narrow one with length. So he sort of just stopped walking, and he said he read the Quran every 3 days until he died. He gave up all of his excess profits to the poor, freed a bunch of slaves, and he died at 58 years old. So I like that. I really do like that quote. I prefer a short life of width to a narrow one with length. I think this one's particularly relevant to him because the word width, he was a polymath. He really worked on everything. It's not necessarily a short life of I don't know, weight versus a long life of lightness, for example. He says of width, so he likes the broadness, and that's what I think applies to traveling, living in many different places, but also different fields of study. So I guess that's his death, and moving on to his philosophy. So he wrote most of his science work in Arabic, which was sort of the language of science in the Middle East at the time. But he also wrote quite a few things in Persian as well, and those became of linguistic significance. So they're studied not just for their actual what they mean, but they're also a literary source. So I guess we'll start with metaphysics, start with the most difficult one. Previously, if you've seen any of these videos on metaphysics, they can be a little bit of a brain throb. But historically, metaphysics have been tied with theology, but after reading his book by Al-Farabi, he got a more clear view than even Aristotle. Aristotle divides it into the essence and existence. So existence is accidental and comes from a cause. Essence is beyond accidental and constant, and it has no opposite. This is sort of Islamic philosophy's way of attempting to get at occasionalism. So I guess, how can we explain this best? Nothing comes from nothing. So there's impossibility, there's contingency, and necessary is the three ways that he divided it up. So impossibility is that nothing can come from nothing. So that is like the void. Parmenides said that, originally Heraclitus said one can't step in the same river twice because everything is changing. And Parmenides says that change doesn't even exist because something has to cause change. So he said there's impossibility, number one. Contingency. This is something that is pretty revolutionary at the time. So that is that something can be nothing unless, so kind of like an if statement. So that brings to life things such as humans. So humans are not impossibility. Humans are contingency, or at least our material component is contingency. If angered, this happens, or if God wills it, creation. And then lastly is necessary, and there's only one component of necessary, which is that, and there's no opposite, there's no definition of it. I'll try to give you a definition. There's proof of the truthful. So this is also his proof sort of God, in that he said there has to be something that it's impossible not to exist, and that is the necessary. And from necessary causes leads to a lot of contingencies. So if the necessary exists, that creates the world, and there's only one necessary, and that is essentially God. So that is where they sort of brought to the East what Aristotle really meant. So a lot of people thought metaphysics was just a whole thing discussing God and theology, but only that one component, just the necessary. Equally as important is the contingency, and equally as important to discuss is the impossibility, even though it's by definition impossible to discuss. But he was often criticized by a lot of contemporaries for being too Aristotelian. This one individual named Al-Biruni had a bunch of correspondences with him. He asked him 18 letters to Avicenna, and 10 of which were criticizing his thoughts on Aristotle. So it's kind of interesting that he didn't... I guess maybe because Aristotle was not from the region, they kind of thought of it as sort of foreign, and that's why I think it was necessary for individuals such as Avicenna and Al-Farabi to sort of reshape it to fit their own societies. And I think it was a tough stance for him to take, but an important stance for him to take, because he truly believed in it. Even though Aristotle looked different from him, even though Aristotle and him probably wouldn't have gotten along, he still thought Aristotle was right, and that's, I think, makes him a better man than his critics. Now moving to theology briefly, I guess the next most difficult. So he thought prophets were superior to philosophers, so even above himself, inspired philosophers. Similar idea to Al-Farabi. I guess, so in terms of theology, he has this what's called the floating man thought experiment. So I guess it's not even related to theology, but the floating man thought experiment. So he thought of, or it could be called the falling man. So when he was imprisoned, he thought about in a castle, he thought about if you were falling, there would be no sensation, assuming there's no wind or anything. And technically, I think he was thinking of in a void, but there would still be consciousness. And the first thought, assuming even if it was like an infant, would be to confirm its own existence. So basically, in the falling man thought experiment, there is something that is your self-consciousness that exists regardless of your body or regardless of any sort of feelings. So that's the thought experiment. Moving on to his canon of medicine, or his Liber Primus Naturalism, which is another book on medicine. Actually, let's move to that. We'll talk about that later. In terms of earth sciences, he thought that, for example, mountains and terrains, he said, the mountains could either be caused by movement of plates or water sort of depreciating mountains. That's, I think, completely correct. The only other way you could make a mountain is a volcano, or yeah, it's pretty much all just plate tectonics. Yeah, I guess if a meteorite comes down, it could, but it would shift the earth and stuff. So yeah, he was pretty right there. And also water, there's erosion too. So he thought, and from all of his science, he always approached it from a first principles standpoint and through experimentation. But he criticized Aristotle's inductive thinking, or thought by induction. So induction is actually like applying something to something else. And I think Al-Farabi would have agreed with Avicenna on this point too. In terms of logic, so he developed a dominant logic system that, well, was sort of modernized by Najm al-Din. But he says, for example, this is how firmly he believed about his logic. Anyone who denies the law of non-contradiction should be beaten and burned until he admits that to be beaten is not the same as to not be beaten, and to be burned is not the same as to not be burned. So this is just basically a long way of talking about mutual exclusivity, but I think it's just shows how firmly he believed in these things. It's like, if you don't understand non-contradiction, go get burned and beaten. So very maybe that's why he started getting enemies, but maybe that was necessary to get him so famous, and that's why so many great leaders respected him, because he was willing to talk in this sort of way. Moving to physics, so in his book of healing, it's called, is not all medicine related. It also talks a lot about physics, his theory of motion. So he thought that there's inclination, which is a tendency to move. I think that could be thought of as, for example, gravity or any sort of static energy. Like if a rock is on a tree, it's got a inclination to roll down, tendency. Then there's also force. It can be applied to something as a projectile. So he thought in a vacuum, well, basically they transfer between the two. So inclination, like a rock hits something, it can cause force and move something else. Not entirely correct. It's just a transfer of energy, and they're actually all this. I guess I like to think of all energy as the same. It just can be in different forms or stored in different ways. But he's still not wrong. But he thought in a vacuum there would be no stopping of a projectile. So this is very much expanding on Al-Farabi's concept of the vacuum. And it's true. In a vacuum, if there's no resistance, there would be an object would go on forever. But yeah, if there's no air resistance or anything. yeah, supposedly maybe he got these ideas from Philoponus in Alexandria in 600 AD. I want to mention that, but I just assume maybe they both came up with it. Assume Avicenna came up with it. Either way, he believed firmly in it enough that he was willing to put it into paper and claim it's not an idea. He didn't necessarily claim it's an idea he came up with, but he claimed it's an idea of his. So he believed in it strongly enough to make it his. It's like the closed fist of knowledge, if you've seen the previous video. In terms of optics, so this is a very cool one. So a lot of people have these the optics. People were still trying to decide whether the light came from the eyes or light came off the objects. They still couldn't figure this out, but he saw that light must have a finite speed. So that was obviously a very important thought, because that is true. It's denominated c in physics, equals mc squared, constant speed of light. If you pass it, supposedly time shatters. So yeah, very important, huge implications on physics. The rainbow, he was supposedly wrong about this, in that he thought that rainbow was caused by these mists between, for example, the clouds and the human, or the sun and the human, and it's actually refraction. But still, I think he's in some ways right, because the refraction is caused off water particles. So I don't want to say he's completely wrong. He was as right as he could have been at the time. He thought heat was caused by the motion of external things. So, not perfect, but it makes sense. The kinetic molecular theory, the more hotter an object, the faster the particles move. But that's not necessarily the cause of. I think, for example, he might have come across this idea. For example, if you see a pot and you put it on a fire, the fire's got motion and it's heating up the pot. But I think that's where he kind of got towards that idea. And also, for example, if you rub your hands together, motion, heat, that's where he probably got the idea from. But it's all just kinetic molecular theory. But nonetheless, this is almost 1,000 years ago today. So more than that. So in terms of astrology, he thought that he did not like a lot of the common astrology at the day. So as I said, astrology is like, it's the just deriving directions from the cosmos. He thought that there is directions from the cosmos and they do have significance, but how could anyone possibly know this thing? Like, who came up with the idea that Mars is Ares, the god of war? Like, what? It makes no sense. So he didn't really agree with that. And he thought that astrology and mathematical astronomy should be separated, which is what we have today. In fact, astrology doesn't really exist as a field of science anymore. It's more of if anyone does study it, it's more of a study of a history. He disagreed with Aristotle. Aristotle thought that the sun was shining light on other stars to create that brightness. He correctly thought that they were generating their own light. He observed Venus crossing the sun at one point. This could have been a fact or truth. False. I think the reason why people remember that is it puts him into the observer category, more so in the observer category, because a lot of our other former philosophers spent a lot of time staring at the stars. Maybe he was lying, maybe he was wrong, but at least what we can derive from this little fact is that he spent time staring at the cosmos, which I think is just a beautiful thing to do. I think this is kind of abstract. Just there's no, you're never wasting your time staring at the stars. Like, there's a lot of wasted times. Like, if you just sit there in a chair and do nothing, if you're just staring at the stars, I don't think you could ever call that a waste of time. But yeah, why? I don't know. I just think it's a good use of time. He wrote another summary of Almagest by Ptolemy. So this is just, once again, another hats off to Ptolemy. So Ptolemy, Theon and Hypatia rewrote summaries of his book, and so did Avicenna. So obviously huge influence, but also shows his respect for Ptolemy and the Ptolemaic model. In terms of chemistry, he did steam distillation for oils, such as rose oil, which he used for aromatherapeutic purposes for heart conditions. Obviously, I don't think that would work. Maybe it does, but as far as I know, using rose essence to cure heart conditions. I don't think that would really work. Who knows? Maybe I might be proven wrong. But nonetheless, he was using steam distillation, which is a pretty advanced chemical process. He didn't discover it, but not only was he like, if you're just trying to get a picture of this guy, he spends most of his day, staring at the stars in labs, playing with steam distillation. These are not like, this is not a guy who likes to sit around and do nothing and get drunk. This is a guy who's really fascinated in all, like from the tiniest thing to the largest things or the farthest things. Just amazing. And I hope this is inspiring you as much as it inspires me. He did not believe in transmutation of substances, so that's like the philosopher's stone. I think that's well, makes sense. Until we came up with nuclear physics, nuclear fusion, and nuclear fission, nuclear decay, there's no really comprehensible way of changing an element's state. So he didn't believe in that. So he was right. Like, you can't criticize the guy for not anticipating nuclear fusion and nuclear fission before they had even discovered the electron. So obviously, I think as far as he knew, he was right. So I'll go through the quotes, and then I guess I'll briefly talk about his legacy. So one thing I think is worthy of mentioning, he was included in Dante's Divine Comedy amongst great Westerners such as like Virgil, Homer, Plato, Socrates. So it's just great that he made that great list. He was extremely famous, pretty much in all the Middle East, famous in the West as well. Here's this is in Vienna, the United Nations. Here's a statue of Avicenna. So that if he's demonstrating, that means he's pretty much respected in every by the global community. Here's an old drawing of him. Here's some old writing of his, and this is a coin from Tajikistan. So obviously loved everywhere and worthy of being put on currency. So knowledge of anything, since all things have causes, is not acquired or complete unless it is known by its causes. So this is kind of going back into the contingency, the three components of metaphysics. Everything causes something, but you don't know what you have until you know its cause. So that's why he that's why he wanted to go back all the way to the first cause, which is he uses as proof of the existence of God, which is, I think, it's a good proof. It's a good proof. You can come up with your criticisms. I don't know if you want how you would like to do so, but once again, the argument is that there has to be something that cannot not exist. So there has to be something. It doesn't say what it looks like. He doesn't say. In fact, at this point, it pretty much been pushed aside that the God is a pantheon, that there were anything of that sort. He thought that God was kind of like a single matter. Almost going back so far back to some of our first videos, going back to dailies and such, coming back to the one principle. But once again, to understand something, you have to understand its causes. And as to the mental essence, we find it in infants devoid of every mental form. So this is kind of, I guess, a parallel would be the floating man, in that there is this mental essence that is independent of your physical state that can be found in infants devoid of every mental form. And lastly, I want to finish this with some poetry, because that's maybe one of the things he's least known for, but I think the most beautiful. If you can read the Arabic here, you can follow along. But from the depth of the black earth up to Saturn's apogee, all the problems of the universe have been solved by me. I have escaped from the coils of snares and deceits. I have unraveled all knots except the knot of death. So I think this is absolutely beautiful. Firstly, I think makes sense because he was always battling with his own physical health. That's why he was so interested in medicine. But he's such a learned person. He is from the depth of the black earth up to Saturn's apogee. So as we mentioned, he was dealing with steam distillation, very chemistry, things very close up. To also, he was observing the stars and such. All the problems had been solved to me. So he's kind of, I guess that's not too humble there, but he redeems himself very soon. So he's like, I figured it all out. I've done my chemistry, I've done everything, physics, whatever. I've escaped the coils and snares of deceit. So that's how he perceives what knowledge is. It's that it's not necessarily knowing everything, but it's knowing what's not true. So that's like, it's like, people always say, intelligence is being able to, do 126 times 33 in your head. It's pretty impressive. I'm not going to do it now, but that is one type of intelligence. But also, intelligence is also having a holistic package. You can find a lot of people who are very good at mathematics, but they don't understand a thing that's going on in the world. So there's also holistic intelligence. But anyways, his concept is just knowing what's not true. So escape the coils and snares of deceits. So just for found truth. But I have unraveled all knots except the knot of death. So that's where he redeems himself, and he's humble, and is that, and that's why he was probably so different from any other philosopher that we've gone through so far, or great thinker that we thought through. He had probably the most medicine-focused career, and he's probably most known for medicine above all. So it's kind of sad as well. No matter how much you learn, you can be the greatest philosopher, the worst philosopher, but you're never going to untangle the knot of death. But also, I think it's that all knots, since his concept of knowledge is that there's snares and deceits, I think it's also that he still doesn't understand it. But nonetheless, I think it's just a great piece of poetry. Obviously, it probably sounds better in Arabic. I wish I wrote it down in English characters, but it still rhymes in the English form. Apogee, Saturn's apogee, solved by me, so still nice. So that's Avicenna. In terms of their comparison, this video is already going on quite long, but they're, I think, pretty similar, and I don't think I need to expand on it too much because one was directly a teacher, but similar. They were both very heavily inspired by Western philosophers such as Aristotle, Plato, and those individuals, but also they also had a lot of that Eastern influence, which was a lot of the mathematics and stuff, and that's why they were very scientific focused as well. I wouldn't even call it a similarity, but Al-Farabi was directly a influence on Avicenna, whereas Avicenna had no influence on Al-Farabi. One difference is that Al-Farabi was much worse, more poorly biographed in terms of his earlier life, whereas Avicenna was much better biographed. So maybe that was because Avicenna was wealthier when he was younger. Maybe that was because he had a more exciting youth and younger life. Who knows what it is? And the time period wasn't that different, but I guess maybe Al-Farabi wanted the privacy, or maybe Avicenna was just more deserving of that story. So you can take what you want with that. And I guess lastly, they were, unlike some of their other philosophers that we discussed, they were not only descriptive, they were also very instructive as well. Even though they said, that astrology stuff is not too good, they both, focus on medicine or focus on physics and actual things that have real world application. And, psychology, as Al-Farabi said, you got to be in groups, how should you actually live your life? And those things I think are very, very important. So thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you watch some of the ones in the future and some of the ones in the past that I have made. Thanks so much. Bye.